A black man is arrested by officers for no reason, but when they discover his true identity, they are speechless. It was an ordinary Tuesday in Harlem. The sun had just started climbing over the city's skyline, casting a warm glow on the streets. People moved with purpose, grabbing coffees from the local vendors, hustling to work, chatting with neighbors they saw every day. Harlem, always alive with energy, felt like a place where anything could happen. In the middle of it all was Malik, a man of 35, dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit with freshly polished shoes. Malik was always the kind of person who blended in and stood out at the same time. His confidence was magnetic, but it never felt forced. As he walked down Lenox Avenue, people nodded their greetings. They knew him around here. Malik had spent most of his life in this neighborhood, and in many ways, Harlem had shaped him. But this particular morning was different. As Malik neared his car, a sleek black sedan parked in front of a brownstone, he noticed something. 2 police officers were walking toward him, their expressions cold and stern. He'd seen them before, patrolling the neighborhood on occasion, but they never acknowledged him. Today was different. They were coming directly for him. "Excuse me, sir," one of them called out. Malik turned to face the officer, already feeling the tension rising in the air. He noticed the name on the officer's badge, Officer Kirkland. The other officer, Mendoza, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting near his belt. Malik kept his voice steady. "Yes, officer?" Kirkland's eyes narrowed. "Can I see some ID?" Malik had been here before, stopped for no reason, asked questions that had no answers. But he had learned to stay calm, to handle these moments with grace. His father had drilled into him how to behave around police. Always be polite, never escalate. He pulled out his wallet. "May I ask why you need to see my ID?" Officer Kirkland's tone turned sharp. "You match the description of someone we're looking for. Just show me your ID." Malik handed over his driver's license, and Kirkland examined it with a raised eyebrow. After what felt like an eternity, he handed it back without a word. But then came the next question, the one Malik knew was coming. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Kirkland's voice was accusatory, as if Malik didn't belong here. "I live here," Malik replied calmly. "I'm just heading to work." Kirkland exchanged a glance with Mendoza, who stepped forward slightly. Malik felt his heartbeat quicken. This wasn't going to be a simple encounter. "Where are you coming from?" Kirkland pressed. "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Malik replied, trying to keep the tension from rising. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just answer the questions," Mendoza said, his hand inching closer to his belt. Malik took a deep breath, reminding himself of his father's words. "Stay calm. Don't give them a reason." "I'm a lawyer," he said, hoping that would end the conversation. "I have a meeting in about an hour, so if there's nothing else..." Kirkland's smirk returned. "A lawyer, huh? That's interesting." Malik felt the situation shift in the air, the uneasiness growing heavier. "Look, officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get to work." Kirkland ignored him. "Mind if we take a look inside your car?" Malik's stomach clenched. He had nothing to hide, but he knew how easily things could go wrong. "I'd prefer if you didn't," Malik said carefully. "I need to get going." Kirkland stepped closer, his hand brushing against the baton on his hip. "Step away from the car." Malik hesitated for a moment too long. Without warning, Kirkland grabbed Malik's arm, twisting it behind his back. The pain was sharp and immediate. Malik winced, but tried to keep his voice even. "What are you doing?" he protested. Mendoza was on him in an instant, forcing Malik to the ground, pressing his knee into Malik's back. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest." Kirkland's voice was cold, devoid of any emotion. Malik's mind spun. This wasn't happening. He had done nothing wrong. Nothing at all. And yet, here he was, face down on the pavement, handcuffs digging into his wrists. A small crowd had gathered, people watching in horror. A young woman across the street was recording everything on her phone. Malik caught sight of her and, for a moment, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would help. Maybe the footage would show the truth. But in this moment, as he was dragged to his feet and shoved into the back of a police car, Malik knew that the battle was far from over. The police station was cold, sterile, and suffocating. Malik was led through the booking area, hands still cuffed behind his back, his suit wrinkled from the struggle. He kept his head high, refusing to let them see him break. "Name?" the officer behind the desk asked, without looking up from his computer. "Malik Edwards," Kirkland answered before Malik had the chance. The officer typed it into the system, his eyes flicking over the screen. His frown deepened as he looked at Malik, then back at Kirkland. Something wasn't adding up, but the officer said nothing. He simply motioned toward the holding cell. Malik was fingerprinted, photographed, and led to a small, dingy cell in the back of the station. The door clanged shut behind him with a finality that made his heart sink. He sat on the bench, staring at the chipped paint on the walls, trying to process what had just happened. How could this happen? How could someone like him, someone who had worked so hard to build a life, to achieve success, end up here? Hours passed. The silence in the cell was broken only by the occasional footsteps of officers outside. Malik kept his composure, but his mind raced. What would happen next? Would anyone believe his side of the story? It wasn't until later that the mood in the station began to shift. Officer Kirkland was walking through the halls when a younger officer, someone Malik had seen in passing, approached him. "Kirkland, you know who you just arrested, right?" Kirkland shrugged. "Just another guy causing trouble." The younger officer shook his head. "No, that guy. He's not just some guy. He's a civil rights attorney, one of the biggest in the city. I saw his name in the papers last week. He's been involved in some major cases." Kirkland stopped in his tracks. "You're kidding." "I'm not. You better be careful. If word gets out that you arrested him without cause, this could blow up in your face." Kirkland's smirk faltered. For the first time since the encounter, doubt crept into his mind. Had he made a mistake? He didn't want to admit it, but the seed of worry had been planted. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd had grown. What had started as a few concerned onlookers had turned into something bigger. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and now, dozens of people stood outside, demanding answers. They chanted Malik's name, held signs calling for justice, and recorded every moment on their phones. Malik's mother, a fierce woman who had raised him to be strong, stood at the front of the crowd. Her face was tight with anger, her voice loud and unwavering. She knew her son didn't belong in that cell, and she wasn't going to let this slide. The media had caught wind of the story, and reporters were beginning to gather. This was no longer a local incident. It was turning into a full-blown public scandal. Inside the station, the officers were feeling the pressure. Lieutenant Ramirez, who had only been at the precinct for a few months, watched the scene unfold from her office window. She had known something was off the moment she heard Malik's name. "This is going to get ugly," she muttered under her breath, pacing her office. She knew they had to do something, and fast. After hours of sitting in the cell, Malik heard the door creak open. Lieutenant Ramirez stood there, her face unreadable. "Mr. Edwards," she said formally, "you're free to go." Malik stood slowly, his body stiff from sitting on the hard bench for so long. He didn't say a word as he followed her through the station, past the officers who avoided his gaze. He could feel their shame, their discomfort. When they reached the front of the station, Malik saw the crowd outside. They erupted into cheers the moment they saw him, their voices loud and clear. But Malik remained calm. He knew this wasn't over. Ramirez hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I'm sorry for what happened today. This shouldn't have happened." Malik met her eyes, his voice steady. "You're right. It shouldn't have." He walked out of the station, into the arms of his mother and the embrace of his community. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Malik ignored them all. He knew that the real battle was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media attention, public outrage, and legal action. Malik's wrongful arrest became the headline of every major news outlet. The footage recorded by the bystanders went viral, sparking debates about racial profiling, police misconduct, and the justice system. Kirkland and Mendoza were placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. But for Malik, that wasn't enough. He filed a lawsuit against the department, determined to hold them accountable. The city was divided. Some stood firmly with the police, arguing that they were just doing their jobs. Others saw Malik's arrest as yet another example of the systemic racism that plagued the country. But Malik wasn't backing down. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, and now it was his own fight. Months passed, and the trial began. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable. Malik sat at the front, surrounded by his legal team, his expression calm but focused. Kirkland and Mendoza testified, trying to justify their actions. But their defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence, the footage, the witness statements, and the undeniable truth that Malik had done nothing wrong. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom erupted. Malik had won. The department was held accountable, and Kirkland and Mendoza were fired. But for Malik, the victory was bittersweet. He had won his case, but the fight for justice was far from over. As he stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Malik spoke with a quiet strength. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about all of us. We deserve to be treated with dignity, with respect, and we won't stop until that happens." In the months and years that followed, Malik continued his work as a civil rights attorney, advocating for those who couldn't fight for themselves. His story had inspired others, sparking a movement that demanded change. The police department underwent reforms, and new officers were trained to approach their work with fairness and understanding. But Malik knew that real change took time. It wasn't enough to win one case or to change one department. The fight was ongoing, and he was ready to lead the way. As he walked through Harlem, the same streets he had grown up on, Malik felt a sense of purpose. He had faced injustice, but he had also found strength in the people who stood with him. And as long as they were united, he knew that they could create a world where everyone was treated with the respect they deserved. Malik smiled as he continued walking, his mind already focused on the battles ahead. He was ready. It was late summer in New York, the kind of heat that seemed to stick to your skin no matter where you went. But the city was alive. And Malik, fresh off his legal victory, had never felt more empowered. His phone buzzed every minute with messages of support, requests for interviews, and new cases flooding in. The legal battle he'd won hadn't just been about him. It had been a pivotal moment for the city, a step toward accountability in a world that seemed too resistant to change. But Malik wasn't resting on his laurels. He was meeting with key community leaders, planning a series of town hall events to address police reform. His victory might have been the spark, but he knew the fire needed to be kept alive. One evening, he found himself at Sylvia's, the iconic soul food restaurant in Harlem. It had always been a place of comfort, where the food felt like home and the atmosphere was always welcoming. He sat across from Emma Rodriguez, a community organizer who had been instrumental in building momentum for his case. "We need to capitalize on this moment, Malik," Emma said, her voice filled with urgency. "People are paying attention. The city is awake, but we can't let them fall back asleep." Malik nodded, sipping his iced tea. "I know, but I'm trying to figure out the best way forward. Legal battles are one thing, but we need structural change." Emma leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "What about setting up a civilian review board? We've been pushing for it for years. Now's the time." Malik considered it. Civilian oversight of the police department wasn't a new idea, but after his case, it might actually have a chance. "You're right," he said slowly. "If we can get the community involved in overseeing how the police operate, that could be huge. But we'll need the city council behind us." "That's why we need to pressure them now," Emma said firmly. "With everything in the media, they'll have no choice but to act." Malik agreed. He could already envision it. A city where police were held accountable not just by their peers, but by the people they served. It was ambitious, but necessary. In the days that followed, Malik threw himself into the movement. He held meetings with activists, lawyers, and even some politicians who were sympathetic to the cause. But not everyone was on board. He faced opposition from city officials, police unions, and those who were resistant to any kind of reform. One afternoon, while walking through Central Park to clear his head, he received a call from an unexpected number. It was Lieutenant Ramirez. "Malik." Her voice was cautious, but genuine. "Can we meet? There's something I think you should know." He hesitated. Ramirez had been the one to release him from that cell, and she seemed different from the other officers, but Malik still wasn't sure if he could trust her. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. "Where?" he asked. "Union Square, in an hour, neutral ground," she replied, as if reading his thoughts. Malik arrived at Union Square, the air thick with the usual hum of the city. Skaters, families, artists setting up their canvases. Ramirez was already there, sitting on a bench, her police uniform gone in favor of civilian clothes. She looked human, less rigid, less tied to the system she worked for. "You didn't have to come," she started, gesturing to the space beside her. "But I'm glad you did." Malik sat down, his posture cautious. "What's this about?" Ramirez sighed, glancing around as if she were making sure no one else was listening. "Look, I know you've been fighting this fight for a long time, and what happened with Kirkland and Mendoza was wrong. There's no other way to put it. But the truth is, this goes deeper than just a couple of bad cops." Malik listened, his interest piqued. "What are you saying?" "There are officers, higher-ups, who are trying to sabotage the reform efforts. They're not just resisting change, they're actively working to prevent it. Some of them, they don't want the public to know how deep the corruption runs." Malik felt a familiar anger rising. "And you're telling me this now? Why? Because you suddenly grew a conscience?" Ramirez winced. "I've been part of this system for a long time, Malik. I've seen how it works from the inside. But after what happened to you, after seeing the way the community came together, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Malik studied her face, looking for any sign of dishonesty. But all he saw was exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had carried the weight of a broken system for too long. "I want to help," she said softly. "I can give you names, documents, things that prove what's really going on. But you have to be careful. If they find out I'm involved..." Malik nodded slowly. He didn't fully trust her, but he knew that any inside information could be invaluable. "Okay," he said. "But if we're doing this, we do it right." Ramirez handed him a small folder, her hand shaking slightly. "This is just the beginning." Back at his office, Malik opened the folder Ramirez had given him. It contained a series of documents, internal emails, memos, and meeting notes. As he read through them, the picture became clear. There was a faction within the police department actively working to undermine any reform efforts. They were deliberately targeting activists, manipulating crime statistics, and even covering up incidents of police misconduct. It was worse than he had imagined. Malik knew he couldn't do this alone. He immediately contacted his legal team and a few trusted journalists, including Clara Nguyen, a fierce investigative reporter who had covered his case. Together, they began piecing together the evidence. "This is explosive, Malik," Clara said, her eyes wide as she skimmed through the documents. "If this gets out..." "We need to be strategic," Malik said firmly. "We can't just dump everything at once. We need to build momentum, get the public on our side." Clara nodded. I'll start with a series of articles. Expose the cover-ups first. Then we'll hit them with the corruption at the top. Over the next few weeks, Clara's articles began to surface. Each one detailed another layer of corruption within the police department, each revelation more damning than the last. The city was in uproar. Protests grew larger, louder. The calls for reform became impossible to ignore. But with every new article, Malik knew they were inching closer to a dangerous line. The people in power wouldn't sit idly by while their empire crumbled. One evening, as Malik was leaving his office late, he felt something was off. The streets were unusually quiet, and he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. He had seen it before, always lurking in the background, but now it seemed to be watching him directly. As he reached for his car door, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A tall man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by the dim streetlight. "Mr. Edwards," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "We need to talk." Malik's hand instinctively tightened around his phone, ready to dial for help. "Who are you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's not important. What is important is that you understand the game you're playing. You've made some very powerful people uncomfortable." Malik stood his ground, refusing to let fear take over. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not going to work." The man's smile faded. "This isn't a threat, Mr. Edwards. It's advice. Walk away, while you still can." Malik's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not walking away from this. You can tell whoever sent you that." The man's eyes hardened. "That's unfortunate. For you." He turned and walked back to the SUV, disappearing into the night. Malik stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He knew the risks, but this was bigger than him now. He had to see it through. The following weeks were tense. Malik had increased his security, but the threats kept coming. Anonymous phone calls, strange men lingering outside his office, and even a brick thrown through his office window with a simple message, "Back off." But Malik refused to be intimidated. The Civilian Review Board was gaining traction, and with the documents Ramirez had provided, they were close to securing the city council's support. They were on the verge of something monumental. One afternoon, Malik received a call from Emma. "Malik, you need to see this." She sent him a video that had been circulating online. It showed a group of men, faces obscured, burning a stack of papers. The caption read, "This is what happens to those who betray their own." Malik's stomach turned. It was a clear message. Someone had found out about Ramirez's involvement. He immediately called her, but there was no answer. Ramirez had been lying low since she handed over the documents, but Malik knew she was in danger. He eventually tracked her down at a motel on the edge of the city. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. "They know," she said quietly as soon as she saw him. "They know I've been helping you." "We can protect you," Malik said, though he wasn't sure if he could. "You did the right thing." Ramirez shook her head, her eyes filled with regret. "I don't know if it's enough. They'll come for me, and if they don't, they'll come for you." Malik placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not backing down. We're too close." The final piece of the puzzle came a week later. Clara had uncovered the names of the high-ranking officials behind the corruption, officers who had been quietly siphoning money from the department, fabricating reports, and silencing dissent. It was all set to be published in the next morning's paper. That night, Malik couldn't sleep. He knew that once this story hit, the backlash would be severe. But it was too late to stop now. At dawn, the city woke to the front-page headline, "Corruption at the highest level. The truth about the NYPD's dark side." The fallout was immediate. Officers were suspended, investigations launched, and Malik became a household name across the nation. But more importantly, the Civilian Review Board was approved. The system that had been broken for so long was finally being held accountable. Months passed, and the city began to heal. The Civilian Review Board was up and running, and reforms were slowly being implemented across the police department. Malik had become a symbol of the fight for justice, though he never saw himself that way. To him, he was just doing what needed to be done. But the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, systems to change, and people to protect. Malik knew that this was just the beginning. As he stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to celebrate the review board's first official meeting, Malik felt a sense of peace. It had been a long, difficult road, but they had made it. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Real hope. For himself, for the city, and for the future. It had been 6 months since the creation of the Civilian Review Board, and the city was beginning to see the changes they had fought so hard for. The board had already handled several cases of misconduct, and officers were being held accountable in ways the city had never seen before. Transparency was becoming the new norm, and though the road ahead was still long, there was a palpable shift in the air. Malik had been invited to speak at the board's first public review meeting. It was a highly anticipated event, with reporters, community leaders, and activists all eager to see what would come next. As he stood at the podium, Malik looked out over the crowd, recognizing familiar faces from the protests, from the courtroom, and from the community he had worked so hard to protect. He cleared his throat, his voice steady as he began. "We're here today, not just because of one incident, but because of years of injustice, years of silence, years of people being treated as though their lives didn't matter. But we are here now, and we will continue to be here until the system we live under reflects the values we claim to hold: justice, equality, and dignity for all." The crowd erupted into applause, but Malik knew that applause wasn't the goal. Lasting change was. He continued, addressing the challenges they still faced, the resistance from those who wanted to preserve the old ways, and the importance of staying vigilant. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, echoing words he had said many times before. "But it is happening. We are building a future where no one has to fear the people who are sworn to protect them. We are holding the powerful accountable, and we will not stop." When the meeting ended, Malik was approached by a young woman, her eyes wide with admiration. "You've given us hope," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I grew up thinking things would never change. But now I believe it can." Malik smiled. "It can," he said softly. "But it takes all of us." Despite the progress, not everyone was ready to let go of the past. Malik still received threats, emails, anonymous letters, and once, even a direct confrontation from a former officer who had lost his job due to the reforms. The man had cornered Malik outside his office one evening, anger seething in his voice. "You think you've won?" the officer snarled. "You think you've changed anything? People like me, we built this city, and people like you tear it apart." Malik stood his ground, his eyes locked on the man's. "You built this city on fear and oppression. It's time for something better." The officer sneered, but didn't respond. He turned and walked away, but Malik could feel the weight of the encounter long after it was over. He knew that change wasn't welcomed by everyone, and there would always be those who tried to push back. But he also knew that fear wouldn't win. Not long after the confrontation, Malik received a call from Ramirez. She sounded different, tired, worn down by the pressure of what she had exposed. They met again in a quiet corner of a local cafe, and Malik could see the toll it had taken on her. "They're still watching me," she said quietly, sipping her coffee. "I can feel it. Every time I leave my apartment, every time I walk into the station. They don't say anything, but I know they're waiting for me to slip up." Malik frowned. "You did the right thing, Ramirez. You exposed the truth. That's what matters." She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know, but it's hard to shake the feeling that I've lost everything. I lost the respect of my colleagues, I've been passed over for promotions, and my family, they don't understand why I did it." "You did it because it was the right thing to do," Malik said firmly. "And that's not something you should ever regret." Ramirez gave him a small, tired smile. "I just hope it was worth it." "It is," Malik said. "It always is." As time went on, Malik began to shift his focus to other parts of the justice system that needed reform. He started working with public defenders, advocating for better resources and support for people who couldn't afford quality legal representation. He knew that while police reform was crucial, it was only one part of a much larger puzzle. In one of their strategy meetings, Emma brought up the idea of organizing a citywide initiative to address racial disparities in education, housing, and healthcare, issues that were deeply tied to the systemic problems Malik had been fighting against. "People are paying attention now," she said. "We have a real chance to tackle the root causes of these issues. If we can get people mobilized around this, we could change the city in ways we never imagined." Malik agreed. "We've got momentum. Let's use it." Together, they launched a new campaign, one that went beyond police reform and aimed to address the broader systemic inequalities that had plagued the city for decades. They held town halls, organized community meetings, and brought together leaders from different sectors to create a comprehensive plan for change. What started in New York soon spread to other cities. Malik's name began appearing in national news more frequently, and cities across the country were looking to his work as a model for their own reform efforts. He was invited to speak at conferences, to meet with lawmakers, and to share his vision for a fairer, more just society. But with the newfound fame came new challenges. Malik was constantly under scrutiny, and every decision he made was dissected by the media. There were days when he wondered if it was all worth it, if the endless criticism, the personal sacrifices, and the weight of responsibility were too much to bear. But then he would think about the people he had met along the way. The woman who had thanked him for giving her hope. The young girl who said she wanted to be a lawyer because of him. The families who had found justice through his work. And he knew that he couldn't stop. Years passed, and Malik's work continued to grow. He had helped transform not just his city, but others across the nation. He had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, of what was possible when people stood up and fought for what was right. But he also knew that the fight was far from over. The system didn't change easily, and there were always new challenges, new battles to face. He had built something lasting, something that would continue long after he was gone. One evening, as Malik sat in his office, going over case files, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his mother, a simple note that read, "I'm proud of you." He smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. It had been a long, difficult journey, but he had stayed true to his values. He had fought for justice, for equality, for a better world. And while the work was never done, he knew that he had made a difference. As he looked out over the city, the lights twinkling in the distance, Malik felt a deep sense of gratitude for his family, for his community, for the people who had stood with him in the hardest moments. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had found the light. The years that followed were marked by slow, steady progress. The Civilian Review Board became a permanent fixture in the city's governance, and police accountability was no longer just a buzzword. It was a reality. Malik's work continued to inspire others, and his legacy grew as new leaders emerged, ready to take up the mantle and continue the fight for justice. On the 10th anniversary of his landmark case, a statue was erected in Harlem, commemorating Malik's contributions to the city and the country. It wasn't just a tribute to him, but to everyone who had stood by his side, who had fought for a better world. At the unveiling, Malik stood with his mother, Emma Ramirez, and many of the people who had been with him from the beginning. As he looked at the statue, a simple, elegant figure of a man holding out a hand to lift someone up, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was his life's work. Not the fame, not the recognition, but the change. The real, tangible change that had improved the lives of so many. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow on the statue, Malik turned to his mother and smiled. "We did it," he said quietly. She smiled back, her eyes filled with pride. "Yes, we did." And with that, Malik walked into the future, ready to continue the fight. Because justice, true justice, was a journey, and it was one he was willing to walk for as long as it took.